Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution.
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 You want a revolution?
You say you want a revolution?
Revolution. The revolution.
It's going on right now.
Welcome to The Revolution, the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we ask today's most successful entrepreneurs to share the tools and strategies they use to build relationships and connections to grow their revenue. Now, your host for The Revolution, John Corcoran.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here. I am the host of this show. For you, those of you who are new to this particular podcast, go check out some of our past interviews in the archives. We've interviewed lots of interesting CEOs, founders, entrepreneurs, and authors of companies and organizations ranging from Netflix to Kinko's, YPO, EO, Activation Blizzard, Lending Tree, and many more. I'm also the co-founder of Eyes25, where we help connect B2B business owners to their ideal prospects. And this is a little bit different, this episode, because this is part of our crypto series, where we've been interviewing experts who have expertise in the new world of decentralized finance. And my guest here today, I'm really excited to have him. His name is Dr. Mark Stephany. He's the host of the Progressive Bitcoiner podcast, which he created in order to give a voice to individuals and communities who have used Bitcoin to foster positive changes for personal, social, and environmental issues. Now, if you are wondering, wow, this seems like a different subject for John to cover on this particular podcast, that's true. However, my background, I worked, as you know, if you've listened to the show before, I worked in politics. I worked in the Clinton White House as a speechwriter for Governor of California. Always been interested in progressive politics and social service and government work. And then also in recent years have taken interest in Bitcoin and some of the ways in which a decentralized currency can help to support some of those values. And so that's why I decided to do this interview. And that's why I reached out to Mark on Twitter, because I saw what he was doing. I checked out his podcast and I thought it was really interesting. So I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. And Mark, such a pleasure to have you here. Thanks for coming here today. And I wanted to start with how you stumbled upon Bitcoin and how you kind of went down the rabbit hole. A lot of people talk about, they kind of get a kernel of wisdom. They learn something, it interests them, then they go down, a rabbit hole and learn something more. And, for me, it came in a couple stages, but I've invested now hundreds of hours studying it. And I feel like you really need to invest hundreds of hours to really understand it. So tell me about your introduction to Bitcoin and blockchain.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on the podcast, John. I really appreciate it. My introduction to blockchain was January 1st, 2017. I was New Year's Day, and I was reading an article in a Harvard Business Review that was on blockchain. And the technology itself immediately struck me as important. And at the time, I thought revolutionary. And the article itself discussed some applications to healthcare, which immediately became relevant to me. And so, having grown up through the rise of the internet, it struck me as something similar, and that I should pay attention to this. And so I just went headlong into learning about it. And I didn't realize, over that first month, really, that there was this whole element of risk taking, to say the least, with regard to the ICOs and the tokens and their their monetary value, that they were being traded as such. But I got swept into that. So what became curiosity became greed. And I got sucked up into the ICO craze of 2017 and spit out the other end in 2018. And it was really just an all-encompassing experience. And like many people probably have had, nobody else, if you weren't learning about it or interested in it, you looked like a crazy person trying to talk about it. So I had to step away for several months in 2018, but realizing that Bitcoin hadn't died yet again, I came back around and I thought, okay, I need to spend some more time again learning about this, and specifically about Bitcoin, because it seemed to have leveled off, had the most staying power in what was initially the narrative of its dead technology was clearly not panning out.
Yeah.
But
Can you talk about the distinction between Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies? Because for those who are not, a lot of times people who haven't studied it kind of group them all together.
absolutely. And I thank you for asking that, because I think it's a very important point. And those of us who believe Bitcoin is the technology behind blockchain, or that is the most important development on it, make that distinction. We say Bitcoin, not crypto. Because the reason is Bitcoin had this very, very unique birth, so to speak. It's based on cryptographic technology and research that's been both in the public and private sector for building for decades. But it wasn't until 08, 09 when its founder, Satoshi Nakamoto, made certain technological breakthroughs that Bitcoin was born. But he released it into the world in a pseudonymous manner and basically backed away after a couple of years. And the difference is there was no what's called pre-mine. He did not take Bitcoin for him or herself or them and keep it. All right. And in turn, it's been what many people will argue a more fair distribution of Bitcoin over time. Yes, there's concentration of it, but that concentration has been going down over time. And it was not due to those who have the most Bitcoin were not VC funded backing. So we compare that to other crypto projects who are, we believe, to be essentially a replication of the current financial system that we take issue with, right? The same financial system that we've seen lead to inequalities. People get unfair advantages from the outset because they've got the money already. So they can give these projects money, they get tokens at a very, very cheap price ahead of time, and then they dump them on retail, right? We see that story time and time and time and time again. And it's not only that, but I just personally, this is my opinion, I have not seen any compelling use case beyond what is, again, it seems to like be a duplication of their current financialization.
Yeah. And so for you, after you had kind of stepped away for a little bit, and then you found that, Bitcoin had this kind of staying power. The joke about Bitcoin is that, it's been written off so many different times. People think it's dead, and then it, continues to grow to new highs. As we record this in July of 2022, it's interesting because it's been a rough couple months, rough year for crypto broadly and Bitcoin also, both of which have been down. But you started to study and understand money. You felt like you had to have a deeper understanding of money. So talk about that. What did that lead you to?
Absolutely. So I think I speak for most people, unless you're in a finance or econ major, you really have no concept of what money is or the history of money, how it evolved over time. And certainly I don't consider myself an expert, but I knew I needed to better understand it than what I had going into 2017. And that's reflective of, again, a desire to better understand the world that I live in. I think there was a time when I wanted to better understand race relations. So I jumped into that topic. There's a time when I wanted to better understand religion. And so I jumped into that to better understand the topics that were pervasive in our society. And I felt money was one of those. And so, reading books like The Ascent of Money by Niall Ferguson, Debt by David Graeber, Coined, there's a whole host of books. And what that allows you to see is that not only is the history fascinating, but it allows you to understand that we're kind of in this experiment, and the past in our current financial system is not what has been, nor is any guarantee of what will be. There has been iterations over decades and centuries and millennia of what a better money, better economic system can be. And so it's foolhardy to believe that we have found an ideal system. And that is what Bitcoin and what the entire ecosystem is attempting to do, is to build a better system. That's what we do as humans. We build better systems that have better lives.
And then it's interesting that you make the point that you studied money, because I want to ask you about a lot of people describe it in different ways. They say it's not money, it's software, or they say it's technology, or they say it's energy, or they say it's all of these things. What are your thoughts on that for people who say that Bitcoin is multiple different things and it's not just money? Some people even say it's not money, it's something else.
And that's such a fascinating question, right? Because to have so many different opinions on the matter clearly tells you that there's no consensus on what money is. There are certain characteristics that define what is an ideal money, fungible, portable, divisible, durable, all of these things. And over time, various monies have been better or worse at those given qualities. And so each time there's a new form, whether that's beads or gold, or now Bitcoin, I feel like you're dialing up or dialing down some of those features to best suit the needs of where we are as a society, as a world. And so it was an economist on the What Bitcoin Did podcast the other day, a clear expert in the history of money in the Fed and the Eurodollar system. He says, I don't have a definition for money, because it touches on so many of these different elements, and we can't agree upon what is the best, because what is the best, I think, depends upon your seat in life, right? And I think that in turn also is a big asterisk for why people have issues with Bitcoin, is because what is it to you may not be what Bitcoin is to somebody in Ethiopia, somebody in South Africa. And that is clearly what we are seeing. And so there is this dynamic element to money, and Bitcoin is a part of that.
Yeah. Since you mentioned it, I want to ask about the way that Bitcoin's been used abroad. So, I think what people have seen is that it's been widespread adoption in places where the currency has been devalued because they don't have a store of value for their money. So you've seen that in Argentina, you've seen it in places in the Middle East, Syria, places like that. Talk a little bit about what we've seen in countries where there's really unstable currency.
Exactly, and it's used more often in those countries as a medium of exchange because of some of its Bitcoin's characteristics, meaning it's non-confiscatable, and it's permissionless, and it's ease of use. And so, and disinflationary as well. So what does that mean? Well, I think it's kind of helpful then to define why I think Bitcoin is progressive, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's great.
It dovetails perfectly to this question. And in order to tell you why I believe Bitcoin is progressive, I think it's important for listeners to understand that Bitcoin has been seen through the lens of communism, conservatism, progressivism, libertarian, socialist. It's been written about through the lens of Christianity, Islam, halal, Buddhism. All of these things, people have viewed Bitcoin through those systems, those belief systems. So you have to understand there's this unifying element there that people are finding. And I just happen to believe that there's also a progressive lens. And it's helpful to define, well, what is progressivism to me? And I believe it's kind of a little p progressive, meaning I give a damn about others. And I give a damn about historically marginalized communities, equality in the environment. When I first started the podcast, I think people thought it was capital P progressive, and I was going to have government come in and want to change the protocol because I believe in centralized authority and all this, and which is just a big leap of judgment for my intentions. But that's the furthest thing from the truth. And so why do I see Bitcoin as progressive? I think you could just go through the simple exercise of looking at the antonyms of these characteristics of Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is an open, non-discriminatory, portable, disinflationary, non-confiscatable monetary protocol. So if you look at one of those, open, no one entity controls a network. It's open source. Anybody can see the code. You can't change the rules, any one person. Compare that to a closed network. A closed network is one that's an authoritarian leader or a few Federal Reserve chairs behind closed doors or politicians. Non-discriminatory. Bitcoin is blind to its users. Anyone can use it. It doesn't care about your age. It doesn't care about your gender, your credit score, your race, or your record. So you flip that to discriminatory system. What's a discriminatory system? Well, one could argue that it's very much like the one that we have, applying for loans, applying for a mortgage, applying for a savings account. All of those are layers of discriminatory practices that many in the United States and more so worldwide face. Okay. And then portable, it can go anywhere. I can memorize a few words and travel anywhere with my Bitcoin. Compare that to the people of Crete who overnight lose their savings accounts, right? In disinflationary, as you're alluding to, Bitcoin, there's more and more Bitcoin being added up until the year 2140, but over a less and less amount over time. And then it's capped at 21 million. And so that provides, a feature much like gold, where there's a limited supply, not as inflationary in the double or triple digits that many people face worldwide. So to that extent, it is very much a money that people find beneficial for those characteristics. And I think those characteristics are much more in demand, so to speak, in environments under authoritarian regimes, under higher inflation rates. And it becomes more of a medium of exchange in those systems as opposed to here in the United States. We aren't spending it as much here in the United States because we're not faced with those double, triple digits inflation, not to mention that you're taxed on it. So there's that relationship for people who live in so-called underdeveloped countries.
Right. What about I know poverty is an issue that you care a lot about. What about for someone who's listening to this, who is on the lower end of the economic spectrum here in the United States? What's your argument to them for why they should take Bitcoin seriously, or why they should understand it better and perhaps put some of their wealth in it?
Over the past 50 years of economic growth, development, of all the technology, technological advancements, and the financial gain that has been wrought from that, most of us have not reaped those benefits, right? All of that money got pushed higher and higher up the top 1%, and that's what we're seeing. Majority of us did not get to benefit from that financial windfall. And it only gets worse the further down the economic ladder you go. You don't have access to seed rounds or a Series A. We lock people out of those investments simply because of the amount of money that they make, not their intelligence, not their skills, but the amount of money that they make. So the people who already have the money get to make more money. That's know your customer rules. And then you go down the line, it's, I think, around 50% of America owns traditional stocks and mutual funds. So if you don't have those, you are losing money year after year after year due to loss of purchasing power and inflation. So you're falling further and further behind, not only individually, but from a generational wealth standpoint as well. So you're never going to get ahead, and your grandkids are never going to get ahead because you don't have access to those assets. You may have some money, but then you get locked out because of either discriminatory practices, or maybe you don't have the right identification, or minimum deposit requirements, all these things, KYC, AML, et cetera, locks people out of a financial system that is the only way of protecting them from loss of their purchasing power over time. So the unique characteristic about Bitcoin, again, is that it doesn't care about your credit score. It doesn't care if you have a record. It doesn't care about your age. Moreover, there's no minimum deposit. There's no overdraft fees. You can set aside $1 a week into Bitcoin and let that sit there over time. Yes, I know there's a question of volatility, but that I understand that critique, and we can talk about that if you want. But this is a long-term play. This is not trading. This is not a year-in thing that you're going to try to cash out. This is about putting away and saving over time. That is very much an ethos of Bitcoin, is saving over time to put it to good use for your family. And so that's what I would say is that here, for the first time in history, you have an asset, and I put an asterisk there too, because it's so much more than that. That is the same thing to the billionaire that it is to the person who's working 3 jobs. You have the same access to an asset that has the potential for providing you, again, wealth that you would never have had access to otherwise.
Yeah. And you mentioned the volatility piece. Let's talk about that a little bit. I think the argument that I've heard from people is that, a lot of times people compare it to other high growth stocks like Amazon or Tesla or something like that, and point out that a lot of these other assets out there have had long periods of a lot of volatility. But what are your thoughts on the volatility behind Bitcoin in recent years?
Yeah, exactly. It's volatile up and it's volatile down, right? And if you hold it long enough, just like any advice that would be given to you for any other part of your portfolio, it plays out, right? And so this year on volatility, I just don't get bothered by anymore. But it's also a product, again, of a nascent technology and a limited supply. And so it doesn't take much to move the market. We've seen dampening volatility since its inception, and there's the expectation that will continue to dissipate over time. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned some of the ideologies that have been attracted to Bitcoin, like libertarianism. I wanted to ask you how it has felt for you to be surrounded by that point of view, which is not the one that you're most interested in. Because that's one thing that is kind of a disconnect for me. As I've listened to other podcasts out there, and there are a lot of big podcasts now that talk about Bitcoin, a lot of them, I just don't resonate with that particular perspective. A lot of it's kind of very, very virulently anti-government, very much laissez-faire, remove all rules, remove all regulations, that kind of thing. I personally just feel that, while government's not perfect, while regulation is not perfect, there's a lot of good people that work in government. I worked alongside many of them. And it's not the most perfect system in the world, but certainly the system we had in the United States the last 250 years has produced a lot of wealth, a lot of great things. So I just want to ask you, for you, how has it felt being in the company of people that are kind of, you're supporting the same underlying technology, but getting at it from a very different perspective?
You're never going to change minds, nor I think have your mind changed on Twitter. And realizing that up front is an important lesson. So I try to take what is said with a grain of salt, especially from anonymous accounts. I just have no patience for that. But I think about what I do as a physician, and in particular over the past 2.5 years with COVID. I would have to sit at the bedside of individuals whose family members had died from COVID, who had been unvaccinated, and they sit there on a ventilator dying as well, and yet still remain staunchly against vaccines or any other medical intervention to try to help them because of some of their beliefs. I had to give up fighting that. I had to give up trying to make them wrong. I had to give up wanting to be right and again, view them through the lens of another and somebody who's making bad choices. I had to do that because it was not helpful. What became helpful was trying to understand that person. Again, that's not going to happen on Twitter, but I try to give these individuals the benefit of the doubt and try to understand where they're coming from. Each one of us comes to Bitcoin with our own preconceived notions, with our own experiences, with our own ideologies. And it's been said that Bitcoin is very much a Rorschach test. And you see in it what you want. I try to better understand what others see in it so that perhaps I can have a better understanding of that person, which in turn allows me to be a better person, which in turn allows me to shape what I believe to be effective modalities, interventions for helping other people. And so, yes, I don't agree with a lot of the libertarian leanings, or on the opposite side, and some of the more far left views. But I want to understand, and again, that is incredibly difficult to do on Twitter, but it is so gratifying to be able to do in person or over the camera. And so that's what I encourage people to try to do, is not immediately dismiss ideas, not to dismiss an individual, but to try to better understand. A lot of that just involves a lot of questioning. And often when you do that, those individuals don't have a why. There's no why behind the statements. And the statements were probably just seeking retweets, and it's at that point you're like, okay, your conviction is clearly a little shaky there, and I move on.
Yeah. I think personally, I'm drawn to ideas, concepts, new technologies that aren't easy to understand at face value, take a while to really get into them, have some depth to them. I was fascinated by Tesla 13, 14 years ago when no one had heard of it. I was fascinated by the idea of how that could change our transportation system. I got involved in a local environmental cause, was an advisor to something that was a community choice aggregation, very hard to understand, but a quasi-governmental agency that has been a huge impact in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I want to pivot to asking about that, about the environment, because that's one of the knocks against Bitcoin that you hear over and over again, that, oh, it's bad for the environment, that it leads to a lot of additional emissions, that it leads to pollution, more energy consumption. What are your thoughts on that? And I know that this is a very big topic.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing it up, because it is an important issue, and it's a conversation that we should be having. It's a conversation that we've been having for 50 odd years, and we remain frustrated and beaten down, right? So I can tell you that Bitcoin only consumes 0.16 of the world's energy. I can tell you that Bitcoin mining is one of the most renewable energy intensive industries in the world, if not the most, at approximately 60% of its energy use is by renewables. I can tell you that it's reducing methane emissions at this very moment. But many people just don't care that the data is not enough. And that's okay. I understand that position, because it's such a shift in our thinking that we've been set in for decades now. And it's hard to wrap your mind around. Being a lifelong environmental advocate, but admittedly not knowing the nuances of the issues, I assumed that it was a person problem. If we just had the right people in office, things would be okay. We get the regulations passed and everything would be good. Clearly that hasn't been the case, but clearly the issue is much more complex. And as you study about it, not only about the technology, but about the grid, about the players, let alone a worldwide solution, not just a solution for the United States, but a solution that's going to enable the global South, underdeveloped countries, to meet climate mandates while not further impoverishing their citizens. That is a very, very complicated task. And I took that complexity for granted. And I thought we could just flip a switch on renewables the next day and all would be well. And that is just simply not the case. Bitcoin mining is a part of that solution. But again, I can give you that data. I can tell you that it's greenhouse gas emissions is negligible worldwide. I can, and it gets compared to smaller nation states' energy consumption. Look how much it's using. But it never gets compared to the United States and how much we're consuming. It doesn't get compared to the traditional banking system and in the tons and tons of emissions that is emitting. And what it ultimately comes down to is not data. it comes down to whether or not you think Bitcoin has value or not. And if you think it has value, then it's worth that energy. It's worth the energy that's put into it, and in turn, the potential emissions that are being put out. So I hope I've convinced some of you to this point that there is value in Bitcoin, and not just for us in the US, but globally. And if you can start to think that maybe there is some value in this new technology, then the discussion of its energy use becomes a lot more fruitful. All right. And up until that point, then it's not a helpful discussion, because again, I can give you all the data to say that it's not as bad. It's not boiling the oceans. It's not doing these things. In fact, it's reducing methane emissions right now. It's who was it? The New York Times just came out with an article, or the Guardian, about how bad methane emissions are, 80x worse than CO2. Bitcoin is reducing those methane emissions as we speak by capturing that flared gas. And
that's actually one of the sides to the environmental argument that I wanted to ask about. I think that's one of the fascinating sides, is that a lot of this energy, which previously had been basically wasted because there wasn't a way to capture it, what has been happening is that miners have been moving to capture that energy and utilize it for something. So can we talk about that piece?
Yeah, absolutely. And so Bitcoin miners want the cheapest energy available. And that's either wasted energy, electricity that's not going to be used, in this case, flared methane. It's also wasted energy in our own grids. And then it's also renewable energy is the cheapest out there, not fossil fuels. And so that's what Bitcoin seeks out, is cheapest energy. And that happens to be wasted. That happens to be renewables. And so in turn, it has the incentive to augment renewable energy build out. The methane example is when methane gets flared. When natural gas gets flared, it can get converted to methane, and Bitcoin mining can be there to capture it. Instead of methane, it gets converted to CO2, obviously a less harmful greenhouse gas emitted. And you can say that, but then people will say, well, just build pipelines and rather than Bitcoin mining. And you think to myself, okay, do it then. But then you have to compare the environmental impact of building those pipelines, the cost of doing that, et cetera, to what Bitcoin is able to do right now, let alone the time that it's going to take to do that, right? So this is a thing that can be implemented right now, as opposed to waiting years for pipelines or other infrastructure to be deployed. Another incredibly exciting usage of Bitcoin mining to reduce methane are biomass, is basically bio-waste dumps. All of that gets broken down and methane gets emitted. And so you'll see, stacks coming off of these trash heaps, and that's methane going straight into the air. So now Bitcoin is allowing that to be, again, captured and turned into CO2 rather than methane. In otherwise a situation that would not have changed otherwise. There are just not the financial incentives or the ability to do this otherwise at this time. And so again, another What Bitcoin Did podcast where startups are doing this right here and now. So that's the point, is that why are we fighting capturing methane at this very juncture when we're talking about a climate crisis? We're talking about making changes right now, and Bitcoin mining is doing that today.
And another fascinating argument I've heard is that the traditional energy system, it's very difficult to move energy long distances. Electricity can only go something like 500, 600 miles or something like that. And so as a result, you have to locate these power plants closer to populations of people. Whereas with Bitcoin, it is a technology that allows us to produce energy on one side of the globe and move it to the other side of the globe, which never existed before. That's one of those kind of mind-blowing ideas.
Yeah, 100%. And again, you're bringing up nuances of the grid that many people, including myself, did not understand.
No. Yeah, no.
And again, you just want to say, okay, let's do wind, solar, and be done with it. It's not that simple. Somebody's described it as renewable energy are prisoners to both time and geography, meaning solar and wind only work when there's sun and when there's wind, and geography dependent, again, in those locations where it's
right.
amenable. And that may not be where people are living, but these are still technologies that you want to build out. Well, how are you going to build them out if you've got these limitations in the not only the location, but when they can produce energy? Bitcoin mining allows the ability to mitigate those problems, which is a more detailed conversation than probably this podcast, but I can certainly give you resources for your listeners to turn to learn more about it, because it's incredibly fascinating. It's so fascinating to learn about how our electricity system works.
It is. But the hard part about it, I spent 3 years as a speechwriter for the governor of California, Gray Davis at the time in the early 2000s, when we had the California energy crisis and rolling blackouts. And it was the top story at the time, huge news. People were talking about it. And I couldn't get 2 minutes into a conversation with someone without putting them to sleep, because it was just like the most wonky of wonky topics. And even though it was worldwide news at the time, it was just really difficult to get people to pay attention to these things. But perhaps because Bitcoin involves money as well, there'll be more interest and greater understanding about it.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. One, we need to be paying attention. If these are issues that we truly care about, then we need to understand them, and we need to understand them better. And again, I speak for myself in acknowledging my ignorance of a lot of them. And I'm by no means an expert in our grids and electricity systems, but I know more than I did. And I know more to better understand that it's way more complicated than I once thought. And I encourage your listeners and my listeners too, to just be curious. And if the environment is in fact an issue that you care about, you can carve out some time to learn more about it, to give yourself that better depth of understanding of what in fact is going on. But I think people will start caring when maybe there's less rolling blackouts, when their cost of electricity is cheaper, when they see more renewable energy coming online. Then they'll start caring, and they'll be saying, okay, how did this happen? Oh, Bitcoin mining. Okay.
And I don't know how much truth there is to this, but you remember like a year and a half, 2 years ago, Texas had this unstable grid and had a bunch of rolling blackouts in the winter. And then I heard that the last winter, part of the reason they didn't have as many problems was because of a lot of mining that had moved to Texas. I don't know how true that is or not, but it was capturing a lot of that energy that was previously underutilized and repurposing it.
Correct. And so what Bitcoin allows the grid to do is basically utilize the electricity that is not currently needed, but also shut off when it is. And that is what's called a kind of variable load. And Bitcoin does that very, very well, meaning, again, it can use as much electricity as you want to give it, but it can also shut it off within minutes. And why is that advantageous? Well, we take for granted that we can flip our switch on and get power, and not have to worry about rolling blackouts for the most part. We take for granted our systems. But if we are going to switch to renewable energy build out, with the problems that renewable energies sources face, again, being these prisoners of time and geography and having intermittent power that they produce, then we have to somehow mitigate those downsides. And that's what Bitcoin mining does. In our grid needs to maintain a certain amount of power evenly throughout the entire system. It can't fluctuate to any great degree because that can cause a great deal of problems and damage equipment. And so that's where you see sometimes more electricity being available because they have to have it at all times. It can't not meet demands. But then sometimes that demand is not there. And that's where Bitcoin mining comes in because it can take that electricity and put it to the mining operations. Well, then people say, well, can't we use that electricity for other things? Why can't we use that electricity for doing other things? It's not that simple. Again, there's infrastructure that is not there. There is the cost of doing so, and a lot of other nuanced details that I don't have the expertise to pontificate on that make that challenging. Questions like that always beget why. Well, why hasn't that been done already? Because clearly that the problem has been present now forever.
Yeah.
So that excess energy is not being put towards these other things that people say, why can't we just do that? Well, there's a reason for that. And it's not doing it just because some people want extra energy there for Bitcoin mining.
Yeah. Mark, this has been a pleasure. And I think you've done such a great job of articulating why you were compelled to create a podcast around this topic. Any final thoughts, anything we haven't covered, any other ideas that you want to leave us with?
Sure. I would just say to your listeners, again, to be curious. Bitcoin is not going away. And we can try to make it more difficult for Bitcoin to exist in the United States, but that's just going to push it elsewhere. To also, again, ask yourself the question, here are individuals that share the same belief systems and care about the same things that I do, and yet they have a different viewpoint on Bitcoin than I do. Why is that? Maybe there's something more to this that I haven't considered. And again, hopefully I've opened that door for you a little bit to consider the millions of people, not only with the United States, but worldwide, who have found value in Bitcoin. But here in the, many, many countries that we haven't even touched on, that they have found value in Bitcoin. And so I know traditionally we look towards government rules and regulations to provide change that we would desire. But as progressives, as liberals, we are grassroots by nature. We do things in our communities. We raise awareness in our communities. We strive to do those things on a local level. And there's nothing more grassroots than Bitcoin, in my opinion. And so I'd encourage us to think that if we truly care about the ends, these values and these goals that we want, maybe we need to consider other means. And while voting is necessary, it is not sufficient for change. While protesting is necessary, it is not sufficient for change. Sometimes we need new systems, and I believe that Bitcoin can be that new system.
Mark, such a pleasure. Where can people go to learn more about you and learn more about the Progressive Bitcoiner podcast?
Absolutely. At the progressivebitcoiner.com.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast with John Corcoran. Find out more at smartbusinessrevolution.com. And while you're there, sign up for our email list and join the revolution. Revolution. And be listening for the next episode of the Smart Business Revolution podcast.